Hey, what's going on everyone? Greg here, and the 2019 iPad Air, or the iPad Air 3, was a real surprise to all of us. A lot of us were expecting that Apple was going to release a budget 10.2-inch iPad, but Apple went ahead and resurrected the iPad Air line, much like they did in 2018 with the recent release of the Retina MacBook Air. And while many have been calling for the iPad Air's resurrection, a lot of people were very quick to point out that this iPad Air looks very similar to the 2017 iPad Pro. And they're kind of right. It has a lot of things similar with the 10.5-inch iPad Pro, but there's a lot of things that Apple did not tell you about the new iPad Air. So let's start with the design of the new iPad Air. Now there is some small changes to the design in the terms of the colors. So the space gray on the new iPad Air is a lot darker than the previous 10.5-inch iPad. It has a much darker finish, much like the new 11 and 12.9-inch iPad Pros. This is also the first iPad with that newer gold finish like on the new MacBook Air and on the Apple Watch Series 4, so it kind of combines the old gold color with the rose gold color. You kind of get a gold color in between those two. Let's move on to the display. There's quite a few differences here between the 10.5-inch iPad Pro and the new iPad Air 3. Now, thankfully, the iPad Air 3 does come with a fully laminated display. A lot of people were upset when the 2018 iPad did not have a laminated display, so if you are one of those people, the iPad Air 3 does come with it, and it also comes with the P3 wide color support and a True Tone display, so you're going to get the same deep and rich colors as you would on the previous 10.5-inch iPad Pro, and you're also going to get that nice True Tone display. Depending on the different lighting environments, it will change the ambient lighting of the iPad. Even the screen size is the same at 10.5 inches, but this is where the similarities end. One of the major differences between the iPad Air 3 and the 10.5-inch iPad Pro is that the iPad Air 3 only comes with 500 nits of brightness compared to the iPad Pro's 600 nits of brightness. Another major difference between the iPad Air 3 and the old iPad Pro is that the old iPad Pro came with Pro Motion, which refreshed the screen at 120 Hz, giving you a screen that had a much higher refresh rate, which basically meant that anything you did on that 10.5-inch iPad Pro responded a lot quicker, or even the animations looked really quick compared to the old 60 Hz display. It also means that on the iPad Air 3, besides not getting a higher refresh rate, that you're also going back to the old latency of the Apple Pencil being 40 milliseconds, where iPads that have a Pro Motion display have the latency of 20 milliseconds on the Apple Pencil. Another difference between the iPad Air and that old iPad Pro is that the old iPad Pro came with 4 gigabytes of RAM, and this new iPad Air 3 only comes with 3 gigabytes of RAM. Okay, let's move on to another confusing point between the iPad Air 3 versus the old iPad Pro, and that is with the chip performance. So this is one way where the iPad Air 3 has an advantage over the old iPad Pro. The iPad Air 3 comes with the A12 chip, which does have some advantages over the older A10X chip found on the iPad Pro. Most notably is that the A12 chip is going to have a better CPU performance. So in Geekbench, the A12 chip on the iPad Air is going to score around a single core of 4,797. The multi-core score is going to be 11,268. Compare that to the A10X single core score of 3,916 and a multi-core score of 9,345. So the iPad Air does have an advantage here. It does have a better CPU inside of it. Now you might think, okay, A12 versus A10, that's simple. 12 is higher than 10, so obviously the CPU is going to be better in it, and the A12 is going to be a better overall chip than the A10X. Well, that's where you're kind of wrong, because on that A10X chip, what that X symbolizes is that it has a better GPU inside of it. So if you look at the A12 chip, you'll notice that it has a metal score of 21,761. Compare that to the A10X chip and you get a metal score of 29,567. So although the iPad Air 3 does have better CPU performance, if you're picking up an old 10.5-inch iPad Pro, you're going to get better GPU performance. And that might have an effect in things like gaming, as well as other graphically intensive applications like video editing or 3D animation. Now let's go ahead and give another advantage to the iPad Air 3 because it comes with Bluetooth 5.0. The old iPad Pro only came with Bluetooth 4.2. So Bluetooth 5.0 has advantages because it gets double the data rate and up to 4 times the range. And it doesn't stop there. If you're getting the LTE version of the iPad Air 3, you're also going to get some benefits as well. And that comes with gigabit LTE. On the iPad Air 3, you're going to get 1.2 gigabits per second if you get the cellular version, where if you got the old 10.5-inch iPad Pro cellular version, you're only going to be getting 300 megabits per second with advanced LTE. Here's another thing that Apple didn't tell you about this new iPad Air 3. If you're purchasing the smart keyboard for it, it is the same exact thing as the 10.5-inch iPad Pro smart keyboard. I, in fact, already ordered the iPad Air 3 smart keyboard. I even went on Apple's website, and if you go to buy that keyboard, it says it's for the iPad Air 3. But when it shipped to my house and I opened the box, it said it was for the iPad Pro. So the smart keyboard for the iPad Air is literally the same as the 10.5-inch iPad Pro. And I gotta say, getting a keyboard that was for an iPad Air 3 and having iPad Pro on it is really a sloppy move and very un-Apple-like. So here's another thing that Apple wasn't really clear on, and that is the speakers on the iPad Air 3. So the iPad Air 3 is only going to come with 2 bottom-firing speakers as opposed to the quad speakers found on the iPad Pro line. So that means you're going to get better sound on an iPad Pro versus the iPad Air 3. Another big difference between these devices is the camera performance. So the new iPad Air comes with an old camera, an f2.48 megapixel rear camera. Aside from this being only an 8 megapixel camera, it can only shoot video at 1080p 30 frames per second. Compare that to the old iPad Pro 10.5-inch, which had a 12 megapixel f1.8 camera, and that camera could shoot up to 4K at 30 frames per second. Also, the flash on the old iPad Pro was removed from the new iPad Air. So if you want an iPad Pro that has a good camera, maybe you're planning to shoot video on it and then edit it on the same device, you might be better picking up the older iPad Pro than going with these new iPad Airs. Being limited to 1080p is really disappointing, and an 8 megapixel camera is similar to something like the iPhone 5S, so that is quite a few generations behind. However, if you don't care about the camera at all, if you don't plan on using an iPad camera, I know there's a lot of people in the tech community that make fun of people taking pictures and videos with their iPad. On the iPad Air 3, it is a flat camera, so maybe you might appreciate that design more if you are opposed to camera bumps. Now, thankfully, the front-facing camera on the iPad Air is still a 7 megapixel camera, so you're still going to have clearer FaceTime calls and improved selfies. And as you can see, because Apple didn't have a keynote, because they only released this via a website refresh and a press release, there were a lot of little details that were left out of the comparisons between the iPad Air 3 and the 10.5-inch iPad Pro. Now I'm going to end this video trying my best to give you a recommendation if you're given the option to buy either the 10.5-inch iPad Pro or the new iPad Air 3. And that really comes down to the price of these devices. Now the iPad Air comes in at a respectable $499. When the 10.5-inch iPad Pro was on Apple's website, it did retail for $650. So between all the differences, is the iPad Pro worth $150 extra? I would probably say no. However, that's not where the pricing comparison ends, because there are a lot of deals now with the iPad Pro being discontinued, of it coming in around the same price as the iPad Air at $500, or maybe even a little bit lower than that. These deals won't last forever, so if you're in the market of this iPad and you want to pick up that iPad Pro, I'd probably recommend picking it up sooner rather than later. So what should you pick, an iPad Air or an iPad Pro if they're the same price point? And I think that comes down to a few differences. If you want a better camera, if you want ProMotion, if you're an artist and you use an Apple Pencil and you want the reduced latency, if you want better graphics for gaming or 3D animation, if you plan on using your iPad outside a lot, you're going to want the increased brightness. That's when I would say to pick up the old iPad Pro 10.5 inch over the new iPad Air 3. So when should you pick up the iPad Air 3? If you don't want to go with deal hunting, if you don't want to pick up a refurbished unit, if you want a better CPU, which actually might be a little more future-proof than the A10X, especially with the neural engine inside of the A12 chip. If you're planning on picking up the cellular version of this device, you're going to get faster cellular speeds. And if you want something with better Bluetooth data transfer and better Bluetooth range, the iPad Air has the advantage there as well. And if you don't care about the rear-facing camera at all and you want a sleeker design, the iPad Air doesn't have a camera bump. So in those cases, I would say pick the iPad Air over the older 10.5 inch iPad Pro. And hopefully this video helped you in picking out an iPad Pro 10.5 versus the iPad Air. It's always really confusing when Apple replaces a product that has some advantages and some disadvantages. So I hope this video was able to help you in deciding which iPad is right for you. But enough about what I think. Let me know what you think in the comments below. What do you think is the better value, the old iPad Pro or the new iPad Air? If you liked the video, make sure you give me a like. If you want to see more content from my channel, including a review of that iPad Air, make sure you're subscribed. And as always, I will see you all in the next video. Take care, everyone.